First off, I want to say um, thank you so much for doing this interview. It's a huge honor to be speaking with you today. I still have your book.
Well, I was going to say, I can show the picture.
Um, I actually still have the pamphlet that they gave out that day at school.
Oh my goodness, that was a long time ago.
It was. What do I have a date on here? No, there's
God,
not a date on here, but I saved it. So we'll go ahead and begin. I did a little research on you guys, on you and your family and things like that, but I'll let you tell your family's story of being on the Titanic. They were teachers, correct? Your great uncle Albert, and they were on their way back to the States.
that's right. So my great uncle Albert Caldwell, who was I called Uncle Al because I knew him well, but he was my great uncle. He and his wife Sylvia had left college and their graduation in 1909 and gone to Siam, which we would call Thailand today, to become missionaries in Bangkok. And they spent until early 1912 there. And during that time, Sylvia gave birth to their son Alden. And as things transpired, I've had to unravel this as a historian, but it turns out that she had a very difficult pregnancy. And Uncle Al always just said very simply, the climate didn't agree with my wife's health, so we decided to go home. But it sounded as though she was genuinely afraid for her health. The difficult pregnancy, far from home. And if I had had a pregnancy like that, I think I would have been that afraid too. And so they decided to go home, and they were given grudging permission to go. They were not, it was not a welcome idea that they should leave because they had 5 more years to go on their contract. But so they went home, and they were heading through Europe and went into Naples, and they were supposed to stay there for 3 weeks for Sylvia to go to a spa that would help her cure her health problems. But there was an outbreak of cholera in Naples, and no way. They decided they couldn't do that. Well, fortunately for them, they saw an ad for the Titanic leaving England in 3 weeks' time, exactly when they planned to go anyway. So they decided they would leave Naples, not even stay, but one night. And they went on a sort of a quick little train trip up to London. They stopped at all the various sites along the way. And when they got to London, they went to buy tickets on the Titanic. And the clerk told them, sorry, sold out. This was second class, which they had wanted to go on. This was what their church that was footing their bill could afford. And Uncle Al always said, I must have looked like a very disappointed boy, because the clerk said, sir, every day there's a cancellation. If you come in tomorrow, you can have the first cancellation that comes in. So he got up very early the next morning, went in to the White Star Line, and nervous and sweating, waiting for, he hoped for, a canceled ticket. And about noon, someone phoned in a canceled ticket, and it was even in second class, exactly what they wanted. So they were the luckiest people in the world. They were going home on the Titanic. So they set out on April 10th, 1912, on the boat train from London to the Titanic, which was docked at Southampton. And everyone on the train was talking about how lucky they were to be going on the world's largest, newest, and most luxurious ocean liner. And people kept saying unsinkable. Well, this is the first Uncle Al and Sylvia had ever heard of it being unsinkable. They had picked the Titanic because it was the largest ship in the world. Sylvia was very seasick, and it was, the larger the ship, the less likely you were to be seasick. So that was their thought. Well, it was weird to hear that the ship was unsinkable. So when they got on board the deck, a deckhand came to carry their baggage for them. And Sylvia asked him, saying, is this ship really non-sinkable? And he answered with the most famous line ever spoken about the Titanic, and everyone knows it. He said, yes, lady, God himself could not sink this ship. So that famous line was spoken by a deckhand to Sylvia Caldwell. And they did have a beautiful voyage, in that Sylvia, for the first time ever, was not seasick. Uncle Al said the tables were piled high with all the luxuries and delicacies one could ever want, and everyone could eat them. That meant Sylvia could too. And it was a very beautiful ship. He went around taking photographs. He went down to the engine room, taking pictures of the stokers. He had a good time with his new camera, his relatively new camera. Anyway, on the night of the April 14th, They'd had a church service in the second class dining saloon. The theme of it was for those in peril on the sea, not realizing that they were the ones. And anyway, Sylvia was awakened by, or was sort of probably lightly dozing because she was sharing the bed with their baby. She probably wasn't getting any sleep. So she felt the ship shudder and she knew something was wrong. So she tried to wake my great uncle up, and for his part, he didn't realize she was calling him. She wasn't calling too loudly because there was a baby who had been cranky all day. So he said he suddenly sat up in bed and realized that the ship had come to a halt because his bed vibrated with the movement of the ship and it wasn't vibrating. So he leaped out of bed, threw on a raincoat, and ran out till found a sailor looking over the side. And he said, "Why have we stopped?" And he said, "Oh, just ran into a little iceberg. No harm done, I guess. Go back to bed." So Uncle Al did. He reported to Sylvia what was wrong and got back to sleep, just barely. So it was very hard to get back to sleep without the vibrating bed. And then someone came pounding on their door and ordering them up onto the deck with their life belts. So they got up. They were kind of discouraged because the baby was finally asleep. They dressed in their oldest clothes and they left their $100 in American gold coins that's still down there somewhere. They left that in the cabin. And also the gold coins are in a little trunk. And unfortunately, that's where the baby's coat and hat were. So they couldn't find the keys to the trunk because the baby had been playing with them. And you know what happens? Baby had thrown them somewhere. So anyway, they wrapped the baby in a blanket, went out on deck. And it was really cold. And they were astonished when the lifeboats started being lowered. I mean, this was just the furthest thing from their mind. And Uncle Al thought, well, he should test it. So he tested his footing underneath on the deck, and he said the deck was perfectly flat. He was that was weird. They were putting people off on the lifeboats, and he looked for signs of panic in the eyes of the crew, and he didn't see any. He listened for the sound of the inrush of water. He didn't hear any. And he went back to get the baby another blanket, and he stepped through and then back through a watertight door that was still open. Now, the Caldwells believed mistakenly that all the captain had to do was to push one electric button and it would drop watertight doors. That's what rendered the Titanic unsinkable. In reality, that was only true in the engine room, but they didn't know that. So all these clues together made them think, well, this was just a precaution. There have been accidents. They had to put women and children out on the lifeboats. But they didn't intend to put Sylvia on the lifeboat because she was not well. Her arms were weak. She really couldn't hold the baby. All the photographs we have of them in that era, Uncle Al is holding the baby. So it was just a precaution. Well, fortunately for him, he had been going around taking photographs with that camera I mentioned. And he had taken photographs in the engine room. And he had befriended some stokers there who were shoveling coal into the furnace because, of course, Uncle Al wanted a 1912 version of a selfie. He said, "Can I shovel the coal and you take my picture?" So they swapped coal shovel and photograph camera, and the man took his picture. Well, that man remembered Uncle Al and saw him on deck, and he said, "Mr. Caldwell, if you value your life, get off this ship. I've been below, and the hold is filling up with water, and this ship will go down." And at that moment, Uncle Al realized that was the answer, that they had to get off the ship. This was suddenly it made sense to him. So at that moment, lifeboat 13 was passing by, and the stokers ran and stopped it and got aboard, and the Caldwells followed. And so they did get off on lifeboat 13, which he always said was not an unlucky number for us. And 13 was, if anybody's seen the James Cameron movie, knows it had all sorts of trouble. It didn't go down smoothly. It lurched forward and back. And when it finally hit the water, it was in front of a pump throwing water out of the Titanic, and everybody was drenched. So they hastily used the oars to move it just a notch downward out of the way of the water, putting them directly under lifeboat 15, which was coming down at a pretty rapid rate. And suddenly 13 realized they couldn't pull the lever. It was stuck. That would have released them from the side of the ship. And so they now were screaming, "Stop that boat, stop lowering that boat." It was very scary. And finally, the men gave up on the lever and were pounding on 15, which is just above their heads. And mercifully, 15 stopped. And someone from 15 threw a knife down into 13, according to Sylvia. And the stokers used it to cut them free. So at last they were able to row away. And Uncle Al said it was only when they got a half a mile away, as directed, that he suddenly could tell the Titanic was in trouble. He said he had not believed it until that point, but he could tell it was well down by the bow. And of course, they had the tragic reality of watching the ship sink. And then they were on the ocean for some hours. Somebody in their boat thought they saw a ship coming maybe an hour later after the ship had finally gone down, but Uncle Al said nobody else could see it. We didn't dare hope, but after another hour, they could see that a ship was coming. And eventually that ship did arrive, and it was the Carpathia. And ironically, the Caldwells had almost taken the Carpathia home from Naples, but they had decided against it in favor of the Titanic because it was a larger ship. Anyway, but they were very grateful that the Carpathia went out of its way to pick them up. And in that way, they were brought back to New York.
I want to say that I read your Uncle Albert really remembered the screams from people in the ocean. Does he have a pretty vivid memory of that?
He did. This is one of the stranger things in my memory of him. He passed away when I was 17, but every time I saw him, I said, Uncle Al, tell me the story, and he loved to tell it. And I didn't remember him ever talking about it. My sisters say I'm crackers because they remember. But I finally, when I was 16, I said, Uncle Al, what about the people in the water? And he just always had a smile on his face. He was always happy and full of joy. And that one time, his smile went away and his face turned really gray. And he said, you just have to forget the screams or you'd go crazy. And I realized that he had been actively forgetting the screams for more than 60 years. So that made a big impression on me as a 16-year-old to see that change in his face. I never saw him any other time without a smile and, really a sunshine sort of look, but no, not that time. So yeah, he just had to forget them or he'd go crazy.
So many survivors don't, from what I read, didn't like talking about it. Why do you think your Uncle Al was so, I want maybe eager is not the right word, but he seemed very open to chatting about it. Why do you think that was?
He was eager to chat about it and he was open to it. One reason I alluded to earlier that they left Siam after much wrangling with their boss, that the boss didn't want them to go. And so when they arrived home, they had no job. They essentially quit their jobs, and they were under some cloud from the church. They kind of had not wanted to go, so they were kind of panically looking for a job. And so Uncle Al went on the Chautauqua circuit right away that year. In 1912, he spoke in little towns all over the Midwest about the Titanic. And he was very proud that he was on the same bill as William Jennings Bryan, the perennial presidential candidate. And he outdrew Bryan because people were just that interested in the Titanic. So he right away began speaking about it. And ever after that following fall, he got a job as the principal of Aledo High School in Aledo, Illinois, and moved on into be a high school principal in Ames, Iowa, and then somewhere in Wisconsin, and ultimately wound up as an insurance a salesman for State Farm. But he established that he was a good speaker. And, to be honest, I think it was one of the reasons he had a successful experience after the Titanic, because it didn't build up inside of him. He was telling everybody about it. He saw it as a public service because he recognized the extreme interest in it. And so he spoke about it for the rest of his life. I imagine his last speech was in 1976. So he really spent quite a number of years speaking on the Titanic.
What do you think was maybe gave him the confidence or to be able to do that? I mean, it didn't seem, other than the talking about the screams, didn't seem like it'd be a very emotional story for him, maybe, or was it?
Yeah, it was interesting. I know the Chautauqua had a slightly religious bent, and he liked to say that it was his parents' prayers that saved him, because his father, who was a minister in Illinois, got down on his knees the night the Titanic was sinking, not knowing that the Titanic was sinking, but prayed for the safe return of his son and daughter-in-law and the new grandchild who he never met. And he found out that his father went to bed every night in Illinois time at 9:30, which is about the same time the stoker said to him, get off the ship. If you value your life, get off the ship. And he always said, I'll always be thankful for praying parents. And to some degree, I think he was still acting as a missionary in that regard, praising God for this miraculous, saving of all three of them. There were very few families that were saved intact. And so I think he was still the missionary, to be honest. But he also, of course, was trying to find a way to make a living. The Chautauqua Circuit brought him money before he could start as a school principal the following fall. And I think that he just developed a good knack for it. He recognized right away that the Titanic was of interest because when they landed in on the Carpathia in New York, somebody was selling a postcard with a picture of the Titanic on it. Said Titanic sank. It gave us dimensions and how the day of its sinking. And so he bought one and sent it to a friend of his, so, and I think his descendants sent me a copy of it. But, it's interesting that he could buy that in New York just a couple of days later when they arrived. So he knew right away this was a big interest to people. So he allowed people to be interested in it for all his life. He was happy to speak about it.
A lot of, like you mentioned, a lot of families were split up. A lot of men didn't fare well. Did he feel like, or does the family feel like his kinship that he developed with the crew and the stokers kind of helped him and the family get on the lifeboat together?
Well, he always told me and my sisters and my parents that it was the stokers who saved his life by telling him to get off the ship. Interestingly, before maybe back right in 1912, he told the media that it was his baby boy that saved him because he was carrying the baby. And it was interesting that, according to whomever was giving the testimony, which was not formally done, it was just people remembering, that when the Caldwells arrived to the lifeboat, it was a mama and a daddy and a baby, with the daddy carrying the baby. Everybody remembered that. That was their outstanding physical feature. And either it was that Sylvia got on and said, "Can't my husband come to carry the baby?" Or she got on and then the officer said, "You have to get on and hold the baby." My general impression is that the officer already knew that Sylvia had a sickness and a weakness, and that the daddy had to carry the baby because only moments before the Caldwells were on the lower deck and they were supposed to climb a ladder to where the lifeboats were. And Sylvia couldn't climb, and they were just staying down there. And an officer came by and said, "My God, here's another woman. You must climb up at once." My guess is that she said, "I can't climb. It was called neurasthenia. We don't recognize it anymore, but that was the name of her disease. I had neurasthenia." And I think that was the same officer. So he orchestrated pulling her up by a rope ladder, putting her, and then Uncle Al to carry the baby on the ladder himself with one hand. I know that was nerve-wracking, but I think that was the same officer. And my impression would be that the officer already knew that Sylvia had a weakness and couldn't carry the baby, so that he just ordered Uncle Al onto the boat. Now, interestingly, one of the great myths of the Titanic is that men were not allowed off. On half of the ship, they were allowed off. It depended on who was in charge, and Uncle Al was on that side. He had no idea that it was different on the other side. The other side is more famous because that's where all the millionaires and very important people were, and those men were not saved, but there were already men on the boat. So there was not really a question that Uncle Al had to, he didn't have to cajole his way onto the lifeboat. He was invited on or told to get on by the officer, but also men were already on the lifeboat. It was a full boat, and it had men and women, mostly women, but it had men also.
Good, how are you? How many times do you think it's your great uncle Albert, correct? That would be, how many times do you think he told you the story of the family survival?
I always say dozens of times, but I don't really know how many it was. Once I got to be a certain age, and we moved from Dayton, Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, then to Raleigh, North Carolina, and he lived in Richmond, and we saw him in Richmond a lot. We had 3 different sets of relatives in Richmond, and we were up there frequently. And every time we saw him, I by then was old enough to understand about the Titanic, and I'd say, "Tell me about the Titanic." So he would tell the story again and again and again. And I really don't know how many times it was, but it was very frequent. Then we had him down to Raleigh to tell all our friends about it. We reserved a local church fellowship hall where actually my sisters and I had Girl Scouts. And so we reserved our Girl Scout room and had all our friends over. And, so he told the story there as well. So I just heard it over and over again from the time I was about 12 till I was about 17. So, it was just a few years, but it was pretty frequent. I'd say 2 or 3 times a year, if not more,
Um, are there any, did they, are there any surviving, do you have any mementos from their voyage to today? I mean, did any photographs survive? I know there's the one on the cover, but their clothing or is anything like that around today?
And I have the copy of the photograph. I don't know if that, this kind of it's in glass, so it's probably better as the book. But anyway, we found the photo of them on the deck of the Titanic among his papers, and it wasn't labeled. It was just in a random stack of photographs, and we thought that was really odd. So we spent the next 2 weeks as a family trying to figure out, you know, are the fashions from 1912? Ooh, they are. And we couldn't even recognize the people. But if this were the Caldwells, is it the right time of life for them to be in the Titanic? Because they later had another baby in 1914. So this had to be between 1911 when the first child was born and 1914 when the second was born. So it's about right. The baby did look to be 10 months old. We could recognize the ships in the background that were depicted next to the Titanic in photographs, and the weather matched sailing day. So in the end, we concluded it was the Titanic. We even found where they were standing. And since then, we've had a lot of experts agree that it's the Titanic. I mean, they were like, wow, that's the Titanic. Where has this been all these years? But other things we found, Sylvia had a little booklet that she had written called Women of the Titanic Disaster, and very short. And Uncle Al had saved a copy of it. And it was her impressions basically on the Carpathia. She wrote it a few months later. And as far as I know, I have one of the 2 copies that are in existence in the world. And also pressed flat next to them were some baby booties that, I thought, could Alden, the baby, have been wearing these off the Titanic? We don't actually know, but their provenance is good enough for the Titanic Museum in Pigeon Forge to exhibit them as his baby shoes probably worn off the Titanic. And they're just beautiful little shoes. We tried them on our 2 boys when they were 10 months old, and they fit. So we know they do fit a 10-month-old. And we also know that it was very cold, and Uncle Al already knew that because he had tried to take a walk before going to bed that night, and it was very cold. So they would have probably had the little soft shoes on the baby. They weren't hard shoes. They were for a non-walker yet, kind of like little socks today or something. Although we don't really know. But that's my thought. and the Titanic Museum agrees they're pretty good provenance.
So the photo on the cover of the book is them on the Titanic.
It is.
From what we, okay.
Albert, Sylvia, and Alden definitely on the Titanic is a definitive yes.
I read too that, is it Alden?
Alden, the baby.
Would that be your great cousin? What would
Well,
be
I
his
guess
official
so.
title?
The way we became related to Uncle Al was that Sylvia and Albert divorced in 1930, and in 1936 he married my great aunt. And so my mother was an infant at the time, so he's always been her uncle, and he's always been my great uncle. So we didn't remember a time, either of us, when he wasn't in our lives. But he did marry into our family at that point and was very close to us. My mother lost her father at a relatively young age, and he would try to step in and do father things for her, and he tried to do the same as a grandfather figure for my sisters and me. So he was very dear to us, and we were very close to him. So
So he's married, he was married into y'all's family then.
technically, since he's Alden's father, I guess Alden would be considered a cousin. But I met Alden once in person in 1971, and he was an old man. He was retiring, and he had discovered that he did not have his American citizenship because he was born overseas, and all his birth records went down with the Titanic. And so he was, I think, getting an affidavit from his father, my great uncle, explaining the situation, and he was there and granted his American citizenship, which was kind of a startling outcome for him. But I did correspond with Alden and talk to him later in his life, and he was very amiable to me and very friendly. But anyway, I can't remember now the original question, but whatever it was,
I wanted to ask too, why were you, and this probably could sum it up for so many people, so fascinated about hearing the story so often? I mean, you probably knew it the first time you heard it, but you kept going back.
I don't know what made me so fascinated with it, except for that I understood it to be a very big moment in history, and that somehow my beloved Uncle Al was part of it. And I guess I do remember this when I was, oh, probably in fourth grade, a movie came on the TV about the Titanic. And my mom said, Julie, you had a relative on that ship, and that scared the heck out of me. But I watched the movie like from the next room through a crack in the door because it scared me. But realizing there was actually a movie about it, I got the understanding that people were really interested in it. And after that, I think I read a book about it. And after that, I realized that, wow, my Uncle Al was pretty important in that. And he was not any, to me, he was very important. He was not a prime mover or shaker or anything like the rich people or the captain or anything like that. But he was just somebody then I knew, and he was very interesting. And he was, then I discovered he loved to talk about it as we moved. This, it was about 2 years before we moved, or a year and a half. And we moved there and we started seeing him frequently, several times a year, if not more. And yeah, he was very willing to tell the story. So I got more and more interested in it. And so I always say that his firsthand account and my enduring interest in it led me to be a history major and to become a historian. So I owe him a lot.
Kind of fast forwarding to present day, how have you been reflecting on the past week, given the submersible Titan and things like that? How have you kind of been looking back and reflecting on all of that?
Now, that was a terrible tragedy, and it just breaks my heart. I keep thinking of the young man who was lost, who's the same age as my students at Samford, and that, and all of them, of course. It's just tragic. And I have often been asked, would I like to go down in a submersible? This was before the Titan, with the tragic outcome of that, but they've had many different companies that have gone down there. And people say, wouldn't you love to go down there? And I'm like, no. And I realize I'm really claustrophobic. I have never had that problem, on land, but just thinking about being in something like that, I said, you know what? I'm really grateful other people do it, and I totally appreciate their efforts, because I love seeing the photographs and the mapping of the wreck and whatever we can learn from it. But I would not do it myself, because I realized I was afraid of being in that small a space. I spoke to an Associated Press reporter once who had been down there, and she told me the way they did it in that company was that they had to practice for 3 hours. They had three people in their submersible, and they would kind of lay side by side for, it was 3 hours down, 3 hours in the bottom, 3 hours back up. So they had to practice by laying in the tube for 3 hours. She said one of the other passengers got real twitchy and was, stressed, but they decided they could keep her on. I think it was a woman. And, but that you had to pass that test. And I told her, well, frankly, 3 minutes. And I'd have been, I said, I'm not passing this test, just get the next person. Because I realized that was a weakness of mine in that department. I couldn't have stood it. So I understand the desire to go down there, and I understand the wish to see it in person, but I also understand how very dangerous it is and how horrible the loss of the Titan is. I just, it's one of it's the kind of thing that, since I was afraid of the small space to start with, I can even, it kind of closes in on me as well. So it's just been a terrible loss, and, regret that these people lost their lives in the attempt to see the Titanic.
So even before the Titan, you had opportunities to go down there, but it was just more of a claustrophobic situation for you that kind of got you.
Right. I didn't have the opportunity to go down there. I just had an Associated Press reporter telling me about it. And several people have asked me, would you like to go sometime? And I knew right then. I said, no, I couldn't do it, especially after hearing her story of it. I said, I don't have that much desire to see it as it is now, in that I've seen the beautiful photographs of it, and I appreciate those, and I don't have to see it myself. But when I heard her story of the, laying in the tube for 3 hours just to practice, I said, yeah, I would have been out in 3 minutes. I just am not, I realized I couldn't do it.
Miss Julie, we're running
So
out of.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, well, I only have 30 minutes. I completely got lost in our interview, but we only have a certain more in town. I did want to ask, before we do run out of time, how do you feel about future visits to the Titanic, especially in the aspect of just tourism?
Gosh knows, first of all, it's very expensive. Only the most wealthy people can do it. And second of all, I think there needs to be a pause while they consider all the technologies that are used. Obviously, this was a catastrophic failure of the Titan. I don't believe any others use the same technology, but we want to know, before somebody else is killed. So it is something for us to, I think, take a pause, consider all the technology, find out what went wrong. They just found the pieces of it and have brought it up, and see if there's any better way to conduct a safe dive. I don't know. I have a feeling people will still want to go down there once they've sorted all that out. But right now, we need a pause to uh, consider the technology and consider what's safe and what's not.
Okay, that's kind of what I need from you. I could sit here and talk to you for a super long time about it, and we might do that. Um, Let me go ahead and stop